Alors, je voudrais d'abord vous accueillir au nom de France-Grande-Bretagne, bien sûr. Pour ceux qui ne nous connaissent pas, on est une vieille association fondée en 1916, pendant qu'était fondée une Franco-British Society à Londres, dans le but d'apprendre aux deux nations à mieux se connaître, donc avec un programme d'échange culturel, etc. Alors, je pense être le plus vieux membre de France-Grande-Bretagne, puisque j'en suis devenu membre en 1962 quand j'étais cagneux à votre place. Voilà. Donc, ça fait un certain temps. Donc, je voudrais aussi remercier le lycée Henri IV qui nous accueille fort aimablement. Et puis, je vais céder la parole à Marie-Elisabeth de Rochemiles qui va vous présenter notre orateur de ce soir. Et alors, nous lançons cette série de conférences avec le CRECIB. Nous avons un partenariat. Le CRECIB, c'est le Centre de recherche en civilisation britannique, et nous nous honorons de ce partenariat. Et puis, nous faisons une expérience ce soir. C'est la première des conférences qui est donnée en anglais. Mais votre nombre d'étudiants nous encourage très vivement à en avoir d'autres. Voilà. Bien, je vous remercie et je cède la parole à Marie-Elisabeth. Voilà, je vous cède la parole.
Bonsoir. Alors, bienvenue à cette première conférence en anglais, entièrement en anglais. J'espère que ce sera la première d'une longue série et en collaboration avec nos collègues du CRECIB. J'ai un passé un peu chargé, moi aussi, avec le CRECIB, donc voilà. Et bien sûr, les étudiants qui en sont membres. Permettez-moi de vous présenter le professeur Roger Brown, qui a traversé la Manche pour nous parler ce soir et que nous avons grand plaisir à accueillir. Roger Brown est professeur émérite en politique de l'enseignement supérieur et ancien vice-chancellor, l'équivalent de président en France, de l'Université de Southampton, dans le sud de l'Angleterre. Il a dirigé le conseil chargé de contrôler la qualité de l'enseignement supérieur en Angleterre, le comité des directeurs de Polytechnics lorsqu'elles existaient, et a été responsable du comité de financement de ces mêmes institutions et des collèges universitaires. Précédemment, Roger avait occupé un poste de haut fonctionnaire au ministère du Commerce et de l'Industrie. Il a ensuite défendu sans relâche la cause de l'enseignement supérieur dans de nombreux conseils d'administration et commissions un peu partout en Grande-Bretagne et à l'étranger. Roger est universitaire, professeur et professeur associé dans 12 universités. En 2007, il a été élu vice-président permanent de la Société pour la recherche sur l'enseignement supérieur et il est membre honoraire de l'Association des administrateurs universitaires depuis 2010. Indépendamment de ses travaux, Roger a présidé le conseil d'administration d'un Sixth Form College qui s'appelle Barton Peverett à Eastleigh, dans la banlieue de Southampton, de 2009 à 2017, ce qui constitue une marque forte de son engagement pour soutenir l'accession à l'enseignement supérieur d'élèves de milieux divers. Il a reçu la plus haute récompense du Times Higher Education en 2013 pour l'ensemble de ses travaux. Son livre intitulé, je traduis, « La crise égalitaire, les faits et ce que l'on peut faire pour y remédier », publié en 2017, ainsi que son dernier ouvrage, « La contre-révolution conservatrice en Grande-Bretagne et en Amérique, 1980-2020 », publié à l'automne 2022, servent de support à la conférence de ce jour. Pour avoir pu le constater lors de divers symposiums et séminaires auxquels j'ai participé à ses côtés au cours des 25 dernières années, je dois préciser que Roger est considéré comme l'un des experts internationaux dans le domaine de l'application des politiques de marché à l'enseignement supérieur. Enfin, d'un point de vue personnel, j'ai eu le privilège de partager pendant plus de 10 ans l'engagement de Roger au service de la promotion d'étudiants de tous horizons. Son soutien sans faille a également donné vie aux actions d'échange d'étudiants et de chercheurs entre Southampton Solent University et l'Université de Reims-Champagne-Ardenne, où j'ai enseigné pendant plus de 30 ans et créé et dirigé le service des relations internationales. Donc, je vous prie d'accueillir chaleureusement notre ami et collègue, le professeur Roger Brown.
Well, thank you very much for those very kind words. And I would also like to thank the Association France-Grande-Bretagne and CRECIB, and you'll be able to tell from that that I am not particularly fluent in French. I think you have copies of my text, and I hope you will be able to refer to that. I shall stick pretty closely to my text, but I shall also say other things as well. And I've promised Mary Elizabeth that I will provide further text to reflect what I have actually said. What I'd like to do today is to answer 3 questions as far as I can. The first question, what are the main inequalities in Britain today? The second question, what are the main causes of those inequalities? And thirdly, if we think inequality is bad, what do we do about it? And as Mary Elizabeth mentioned, I have written a number of books on this and related subjects, and they are still in print and available for you to purchase. But before I answer my questions, or try to, I just want to say a word about why it is that inequality is, in my view, a very bad thing. Because there are people, some quite distinguished people, who have said that inequality is good. And in particular, economic inequality is good because it makes people more entrepreneurial, more efficient, more enterprising. And that is a traditional argument that has run for many, many years. In my 2017 book, however, I identified 5 areas of damage that inequality does to a healthy society, and they are listed in my text. First, it destroys social cohesion. You cannot have a cohesive society where there are such huge differences between people in terms of income and wealth. Secondly, social mobility falls because people who come from poor backgrounds struggle to progress their careers. In education, it is damaging because of the different amounts of resources that families have to invest in their offspring, their children's education. It is bad for the economy because not everybody has the resources to be able to buy or sell goods and services that a healthy economy needs. And above all, it's bad for the political system because of the way in which economic power tends to work with political power. And I shall expand on some of these points as we go through. Finally, it is bad because it affects climate change. It is quite clear that a high proportion of the carbon emissions that threaten our world come from a small, relatively small number of wealthy people. But as I say, the really damaging thing about inequality is the association of wealth with power. If I may, I would just like to quote from my book about the collective effect of inequality on a society. And I say there that a society with less inequality, a more equal society, will be socially more cohesive, have more social mobility, will be better educated, more tolerant, healthier, have less crime, be more sustainable and more productive, and will have a better political system where ordinary citizens are involved in governance in some way, and where the policies adopted by governments reflect a wide range of interests and not just those of the wealthy. And at point, I shall come back to that. And the basic point is that what people get out of a society ought in some way to be proportionate to what they contribute to society. And it's worth noting that according to a recent Oxfam report, it's been quoted in the newspapers, since the pandemic, COVID, almost 2/3 of the new wealth that has been generated since the start of the pandemic has gone to the richest 1%. The best off have taken $26 trillion in new wealth up to the end of 2021, which was 2/3 of the total additional wealth, and the rest went to the remaining 99% of people. I shall come back to those figures. So let me now come to my first question. What are the main forms of inequality in modern Britain? Well, you will, I'm sure, well understand that we have significant levels of gender inequality, ethnic inequality, inequality of sexual orientation. But these are very, very hard to measure and to talk about. The form of inequality that has attracted a lot of political attention, and I'm sure this is probably true in France as well, has been geographic inequality, the differences between different parts of the country, regional inequality, and particularly the gap in wealth and economic power between London and the Southeast on the one hand, and the rest of the country on the other. And I just give you some figures to illustrate that. In 2019, income per person in the richest local authority area was £52,500, and in the poorest local authority, it was 4.5 times in the poorest local authority. The richest authority was in London, and the poorest authority was in Nottingham in the East Midlands. If you then turn to wealth, the Southeast has a median average household wealth of £388,000, and in the Northeast, the average household wealth is £165,000. If you take health expectancy, life expectancy, it is 53.3 years in Blackpool in the Northwest and 72 years in Richmond in Greater London. If you take children with obesity, which is a very good indicator of health, of future health or lack of it, the level of childhood obesity is twice in the poorer areas than it is in the wealthy areas. And there are many other statistics of that kind, which one could quote. So what has happened with regional inequality is that there has in effect been a transfer of wealth from the North and the Midlands, the old industrial areas of Britain, to the Southeast, London and the Southeast, the area of services, in particular finance. As one way of illustrating that, I list the difference between the composition of the Football League, the first professional soccer league anywhere in the world, in 1888, and the Premier League in 2023. In the original Football League, there were 12 teams, 6 came from Lancashire, and 6 came from the West Midlands, including, as it happens, the team that I support. In 2023, in the Premier League, which is the richest professional league anywhere in the world, and by the way, I should say in 1888, there were no teams from London or the Southeast. In 2023, half of the teams in the Premier League come from London or the South Coast. And I think that's a pretty striking demonstration of regional inequality. Now, just to be quite clear, Britain is not the only country that has these regional disparities. You have them in France, you have them in Germany. It's not unfamiliar, but it is much worse in Britain than anywhere else in Western Europe. And indeed, the government, as you may know, has developed what's called a levelling up policy to try to even up some of these inequalities. I don't think anyone thinks that that will be effective. So that's all I want to say about regional inequality. I'm happy to answer questions about it. What I want to focus on today is economic inequality, or if you like, socioeconomic inequality, inequalities of income and wealth. And I do that for 3 reasons. First of all, because we actually have some good data on it. It's always helpful to have some information. Secondly, because socioeconomic inequality meshes in with other forms of inequality, such as I've just been talking about regional inequality. And thirdly, because in European terms, or Northern European terms, Britain is an outlier. Britain has higher levels of socioeconomic inequality than any other country of its kind in Western Europe. And one way of measuring that is that there is something, a measure called the Gini coefficient, which shows how much inequality of income there is in a society. And there is a table in the text there which shows that. I'm sorry it's not in color. And you can see from that that in the OECD countries, okay, South Africa and Brazil have the highest levels of inequality, then the United States, then the United Kingdom. By the way, France seems to be catching up. I just warned you of that fact. And it's clear that the UK and the US, in terms of the family of advanced industrial nations, stand out for their levels of inequality. And in the lecture, I point out the reasons why there is this Anglo-American position. And it stems from the fact that we are countries that have not reformed our institutions in ways in which might have been expected. I won't go into detail on that. I think you have to take it that is the case. Now, coming then to some figures, some information. In both Britain and America, there has been a particularly strong increase in the share of total income taken by the top 1% of the population. And you may say that doesn't matter very much, it's only 1%. But then you look at the figures. In Britain, the top 1% in 2019-20 were responsible for 8% of all income. In America, the top 1% has 22% of total income. So 1% in America has more than a fifth of total income. And if you then go to the top 20%, in Britain, the top 20% have almost 40% of total income. And the bottom 20% have only 8%. Now, you just think about those figures and what they mean. And then it's not just about income, because there is then an association with levels of poverty. The government's official figures show that in Britain, there are 17 million people living in poverty, and poverty is defined here as 60% of national median income. Okay, 17 million people are living in poverty, and in America, the figures are even greater. And I'm just talking there about income, but then you turn to wealth, and the position is even more extreme. In the UK, in 2018 to 20, each of the richest 1% owned an average of £3.6 million of wealth, 230 times higher than the 15,000 or less for the less wealthy 10%. The top 20% have 63% of total wealth. The bottom 20% have 5% of wealth. And as always in America, it's even worse. The top 1% in 2021 owned 26.8% of all household wealth. And these are official figures. I'm not making them up. They're official. This is the American figure is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which deals with these matters on behalf of the US Federal Bank. Moreover, when you look at wealth, these figures understate the degree of concentration because of the steps that the wealthy take to disguise their wealth. One estimate is that between 30 and 40% of all the wealth of the top 0.1% of UK households is owned abroad. The amount of wealth that exists in the form of property that is then owned by companies that are registered outside the UK which are then run by trusts where nobody can find out who the owners of the trusts are, is a huge amount of money. And there is a book called Butler to the World, which explains how London is at the center of all of this disguising of information. So that was a position before we had the COVID pandemic. And although it's still quite early, it seems clear that the COVID pandemic has made these disparities, these differences worse. And so has the policy known as quantitative easing, the macroeconomic policy pursued by many central banks of buying up government debt in order to release cash into the economy, which of course increases the value of financial assets, which are mostly owned by the wealthier people. Now, up to now, I've just been talking about individuals or families, households. There is another way of measuring inequality, and that is called the functional measure. In other words, you take a total income from a country or an economy, and you divide it between people who get their income from wages and people who get their income from capital, from interest, from rents, and from dividends. And these are the two shares within national income. In the UK, the share of national income taken by wages fell from nearly 70% between 1955 and 1969 to 60%. In other words, the share of wages in national income fell. And in America, they also fell. And when you think about this, is a very significant fact, because the income figures include wages from people in the financial sector, which in a sense are a distorting factor. This reflects the fact that wages in Britain and America particularly have not kept pace with inflation or rises in productivity. What we have seen over the past 30 to 40 years, particularly in Britain and America, has been an upward transfer of wealth away from the people who earn their living through wages to people who benefit from capital. Now, I have to say that your great economist, Thomas Piketty, was one of the first people to draw attention to this, and I salute his work, and it does demonstrate how in Britain and America particularly, what we have, and it's a lovely French word, a rentier economy, people who are living off their capital. At the same time, there has been a compression in the wages on which most of the population rely. This has been due to increased returns to capital, higher levels of top remuneration, which I'll come to in a moment, and lower rates of tax and the weakening of the trades unions. I'll come back to the causes in a moment. In Britain, the most recent estimate is that the average annual pay of chief executives of top companies was £3.4 million, which is 103 times the median full-time workers' pay of £33,000. In other words, it takes a chief executive of a listed company less than 4 days to surpass the wage of the average worker. When I was revising my lecture, I happened to be reading a book about Maynard Keynes, the great economist, and I found something that Keynes wrote, which I'd just like to read to you. It's very short. He said, "How long will it be found necessary to pay city men," and he meant people who work in financial services, "so entirely out of proportion to what other servants of society commonly receive for performing social services not less useful or difficult?" And Keynes wrote that in 1913. So that, I think, tells you that it's a long-standing problem. So I hope you will accept from what I've said that Britain particularly has, I think, indefensibly high levels of inequality, both of income and of wealth. But why? What are the causes of these inequalities and other inequalities linked to them, as I've described? Well, I don't know about other scholars, but I distinguish between what I call structural factors and institutional factors. So the structural factors are phenomena like globalization, for instance, which affect all countries, irrespective of which country it is. And then there are also institutional factors, which are particular to a particular country at a particular time. And I list them in the text, and there's no originality about this. Globalization, the progressive removal of barriers to the cross-border movement of goods, services, and people, and finance. The second one is what is called, I'm sorry for the jargon, this is not the language of Shakespeare, I'm afraid, skill-biased technological change, the use of more sophisticated machinery, which means you have to have workers who have higher qualifications. We're getting to the point where in a modern economy, you can either be a researcher or a barista. There isn't really much between them. Changes in the organization of work, what has been called the gig economy, people working on 0 hours contracts or no contracts at all. Changes in household structure, as there are more women in the workforce with degrees, they tend to marry partners who have degrees. What is called assortative mating, again, I apologize, this is not Shakespeare. The growth in winner-take-all markets, where people at the top are paid disproportionate to their value, and of course, capitalism itself. But then I also identify what I call institutional causes. And the first one of those, and I'm sorry if you groaned when you hear it, is our old friend neoliberalism. The policies of deregulation, privatization, tax reductions, reductions in welfare spending, and linked to that, deflating macroeconomic policies where a greater priority is given to curbing inflation than is given to curbing unemployment. Now, having studied this for quite a long time, my conclusion was that the institutional factors were very important because the structural factors affect everybody. All the advanced Western countries are affected by these factors, by globalization, by technological change, and the other things I mentioned. France is no exception to this. Any Western country has those. But not all countries are equally unequal, and not all have seen the big increases in inequality that we've seen, particularly in Britain and America, since the 1980s. And the reason, therefore, why I think the inequality has grown so much in these countries is due to the neoliberal reforms, the policies I've just described, deregulation, privatization, reductions in tax, reductions in welfare spending, etc. And linked to those have been these deflationary macroeconomic policies where curbing inflation is seen as being far more important than reducing unemployment. And in my most recent book about the counter-revolution, I argue that these policies were not an accident. They were a deliberate attempt to reverse changes in both Britain and America that had been designed to reverse the previous high levels of inequality. So in America, the New Deal was about redistributing income away from the very wealthy. And in Britain, of course, we had the welfare state. And what we've had since the 80s, under Mrs. Thatcher in Britain and then other prime ministers to follow, America has had under President Reagan and subsequently, has been this conservative counter-revolution. And the beneficiaries have been the wealthy owners of property and financial assets, big business, and the financial sector, the city and Wall Street. So that's my conclusion on the basis of quite a bit of study of why we have these higher levels of inequality. Now, there are other historic reasons. I go back to the comparison between America and Britain that I mentioned earlier. I don't think it's an accident that America and Britain do have these much higher levels of inequality. And in the text that you have, I try to give some explanations for that. And one reason is that both countries were victors in 1945 It is absolutely cardinal to understand British or American policy, that neither country has been defeated in a major war, has never had an occupying army occupying it. And that is an absolutely fundamental point. Secondly, both countries are declining. They're declining hegemons. Up until the Second World War, the British Empire was the largest physical empire. The Americans have a virtual empire where they control much of what goes on in the world. Both countries have what are called adversarial politics. They have winner-take-all, first-past-the-post electoral systems, which lead, according to a political scientist called Duverger, to the tendency of the electorate to align itself with one of two major parties, if you like. We do not have any form of proportional representation, and that means that many people, their votes are wasted because basically they're living in the wrong place. And that is one reason for the Brexit vote, people feeling that they were neglected by the political system. And it also means that our politics, and American politics even more so, are very, very polarized. You can't look at American politics now without seeing the degree of polarization that is there. Then there are further parallels. Both our economies, Britain and America, are driven by consumption, and both have failed to create a balance between consumption, imports and debt on the one hand, and investment, exports and savings on the other. Britain has catastrophically low levels of savings, and America isn't much better. Both countries run huge external deficits and have done so for many years. Of course, that benefits the exporting countries, Germany, Japan, China, who don't have to promote their local consumption because they can rely upon us. In both Britain and America, a lot of power, a lot of wealth is linked to high levels of ownership of property and high levels of house price inflation. One could say much more about that. Both Britain and America have dominant financial sectors. If you want a healthy economy, you do not want the City of London, you do not want Wall Street. They simply detract from the performance of the economy. I have a study from the University of Sheffield that between 1995 and 2015, the UK finance sector made a negative contribution to the UK economy in terms of lost growth potential of £4.5 billion. Just think about that. That's the cost of having the City of London. Then you must already have realized both Britain and America have very strong cultural beliefs in favor of individualism, self-reliance and self-government, transmitted originally through emigration from the British Isles in the 17th and 18th centuries, owing a great deal to the Puritan challenge to the established church in Britain, particularly from the mid-16th century, and encapsulated in the writings of John Locke, Tom Paine, John Stuart Mill. I'd add, of course, that Tom Paine is also a very important figure in French intellectual history as well. And then finally, the many intellectual and political exchanges between the two countries and a common language and traditions, etc. And so neoliberalism as a theory is very, very prominent even now in Britain and America. And we saw that recently with the disastrous short-lived premiership of Liz Truss. So those are the reasons, in my view, why Britain and America have these common characteristics. And the two major features of the two economies since the 1980s has been greater inequality and lower economic growth. Now, there's a story about Henry Ford, who obviously was a very, very successful maker of cars in America from the 20s onwards. And the other car makers said to Henry Ford, "Why do you pay your workers so much? We can't compete. We can't pay our car workers as well as General Motors, Chrysler. Why are you paying your workers?" And Henry Ford said, "So they can afford to buy my cars." It was absolutely obvious to him. The fact is that what has happened is that because of the way in which both income and wealth have gone towards the better off people, So that has reduced the demand, and basically our economies are suffering from a shortage of demand. We've had deflationary macroeconomic policies. We've had the concentration of wealth that I've indicated, and the result, I'm afraid, has been that we have had greater inequality and poor growth. Now, you may want to argue about the economic impact, but the evidence for the damaging effect of inequality on growth doesn't come from me. It comes from the International Monetary Fund. Okay, now the International Monetary Fund and the OECD for many years were strong advocates of these neoliberal policies. They applied them to developing countries, they applied them to countries like Britain and France. They really believed that it was necessary to have lots of free markets, strong financial sectors, reduced tax and all the rest of it. And then about 10 years ago, they started to change their tune and they started to produce reports, the IMF particularly, which showed that inequality was not only damaging in social terms, but it was also damaging in economic terms as well. And when we had this Prime Minister Truss, who was out of power very quickly, this was because the finance sector didn't support her reforms. The first international organization to criticize her was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and they did so not because of the impact on the economy, but because of the impact on inequality. And they said these reforms, tax cuts, etc., will make the economy worse. Can you believe it? Talk about the convert, if you like, the zeal of the convert in biblical terms. Here was the IMF, the OECD, completely throwing over all the advice they'd given to governments for 20 or 30 years about how you should run very tight economic policies. You should, let markets have their say, don't regulate and so on. That's the evidence, therefore. So to answer my third question, if you're still with me, what do we do about this? How do we reverse these trends and these figures? And I'm not making these figures up. They are all in official publications, so they must be true, mustn't they? Or at least they have some authority. Okay, well, I have a number of suggestions to make, and you may well want to ask me about these. In Lenin's words, what is to be done? Well, I've used the word neoliberalism, and I find, I'm afraid, that people tend to switch off when I mention neoliberalism. But these are the policies that we have had. You leave everything to the market, very limited role for governments or the state. You deregulate, you give markets as much and competition as much scope as they can possibly have. You privatize as far as you can. You put what were previously public services into private ownership. You know about all these. These are not peculiar to Britain. You have the idea that the lower tax rates on individuals and companies, the better, because that will make them more economic, more efficient and more enterprising. You cut social security, welfare spending. You don't provide social housing. You cut the funds for education. You're familiar with all that. That's the neoliberal thrust. Now, I think all these policies rather miss the point. What is fundamental about it is the view that neoliberalism takes of the individual. And basically, they see the individual, you and me, as pieces of capital to be developed in the same way that you would develop any other piece of capital. So, for example, in Britain, full-time undergraduate students, part-time undergraduate students pay fees. The fee doesn't cover the whole of the cost of their education. It covers about half or perhaps a bit more. And that's on the basis that since the students benefit from their higher education, they can jolly well pay for much of it. And this is on the classic neoliberal principle that the user pays. And neoliberals would like people to pay for their health, for their housing, for their education, etc. And that reflects their view of people as a commodity, basically, a monetized commodity. So the first thing we have to do is to challenge the basis of all these policies. Secondly, and again, this will be obvious to most people and it won't be a surprise, we have to recognize that creating wealth in a healthy society requires both individual and collective work, so that public and private are complementary rather than competing. The essence of the neoliberal approach is what's called possessive individualism. We're all individuals. Mrs. Thatcher's famous statement, "There is no such thing as society." Does that mean she has her own private ambulance service if she trips over the curb? I don't think anyone ever dared to ask her the question, but that is what it's about. We have to be much more positive about the role of the state, and therefore about taxation. There's no other basis for it. We have to be realistic in thinking about taxation on income and wealth, because we've had such huge reductions in tax. Now, to be fair, not all of that is slightly a matter of perception rather than reality, but no doubt overall tax rates are lower than they were previously. And we also have to take action against tax evasion and avoidance, where I'm afraid that we will need to have international collaboration. In Britain, according to, again, official figures, the poorest 20% of households spend 23% of their disposable income on taxes. The figure for the top 20% is 9%. You can't have a situation where poorer people are losing a higher proportion of their income in tax than people who are better off. We have to find ways also, I think, of looking at the company contribution to all that, the corporate contribution. Number 4, we have to redress the imbalance in power between capital and labor. One of the reasons why inequality has risen so much in Britain and America is that the Thatcher-Reagan program was all about destroying the trade unions. And I'm afraid our present government to some extent follows that. Now, I dealt with trade unions a lot when I was the head of a university. I worked with trade unions in the civil service. I'm not a dewy-eyed supporter of trade unions, but they are important to the way in which power is shared, and there can be proper political discussions about these kind of issues. We have to enable employees to play more of a role in the government of their organizations. We have to tackle labor market flexibility, people who work either without a contract or with a contract that is meaningless. There's just in Britain been the first strike of Amazon workers. I think the government should certainly support them. We have to be much tougher on market concentration. Ironically, at the same time as we're being told about the benefits of competition and markets, in both Britain and America, there has been a tremendous development of monopolies, cartels, and various other forms of market control. You'll, I'm sure, know of Adam Smith's famous comment that when businessmen can get together, they get together to discuss ways of carving up the market between them. Well, that's what's been going on in Britain and America incessantly for the past 40 years or so. That again can't be tackled by an individual national government. It requires international cooperation. We also have to look at the various subsidies and reliefs and benefits that companies enjoy, much of which is not justified. But more important than any of those, we have to unwind, destroy, control the connections between private, individual, and corporate wealth on the one hand, and political power on the other. And this includes the power that comes from the ownership of the media. A first step here would be full public disclosure of all contributions to political parties and political activities, particularly contributions from abroad, particularly from Russia. The Conservative Party gets a huge amount of income from people from Russia, based in Russia, with Russian connections. And in fact, I think that we should try to limit private contributions to political parties altogether. Basically, what should happen is that the only people who can belong to political parties are individuals. They pay a subscription, and then the state matches their subscription up to a certain point. Otherwise, you have the situation in Britain where private contributions have political consequences. We have a very current example. At the start of the pandemic, the government placed contracts for the supply of protective equipment. Many of these contracts went to friends of members of the government. This is just appalling. You cannot have this. It's got to be much more transparent. We have to, at the same time, change our political systems to make them more representative and also with greater decentralization. I'm afraid that America and Britain are increasingly resembling some Latin American countries where money and personal connections matter more than anything else. And that is very evident if you look in our newspapers or our media. Almost every day there is some scandal or crisis which involves these kinds of connections. We also have to try to weaken the association between education and socioeconomic status. And you will know about the role of our so-called public schools, which of course are really private schools, which of course benefit a particular small segment of the population. We have to, in Britain, remove away the incentives to invest in property, such as the fact that you don't pay capital gains tax on your sale of your main domestic property. I know that's controversial. We have to reorient macroeconomic policy. We should worry much less about inflation and much more about unemployment and the quality of employment. These are all, may sound quite a large agenda, but we have to do something about inequality, and I can only offer these as suggestions, really. But we have to go a bit further. I think we also have to relook again at controls on movements of capital across frontiers. The book I'm reading at the moment is about the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which attempted to get some kind of collective international control over currency movements and currency fluctuations. And we now need, I think, something else, something like that. And the argument is that those currency fluctuations, the competitive devaluations in the 30s, led to fascism and ultimately to World War II. So those are my three questions. We've looked at socioeconomic inequality in Britain. It's risen considerably since the 1970s. That is not an accident. That is a result of political, institutional decisions that have been taken and could be reversed if there was a necessary political will. I've also mentioned other forms of inequality, such as regional inequality, but my argument is we should focus on socioeconomic inequality because that is related to almost everything else, really. But that is the main form of inequality that we have in Britain. The other country which has outstanding levels of inequality is the United States. And I think there are good reasons why Britain and America share that. And I think you'll find that the other major Anglophone economies, such as Canada, Australia, also have relatively high levels of inequality for very similar sorts of reasons. So there's no argument about the levels of inequality that are there. I've quoted you official statistics. This is not a new subject. These are not new figures. This has been going on for 30 to 40 years. Inequality has gone steadily up in that time. The reasons for it, as I say, it's a complicated subject. It's a mixture of structural factors like globalization that all our economies are facing, and also these institutional decisions, and in particular, this counter-revolutionary power that I've talked about. And I've given you my program for reform. I'm not desperately optimistic about it. What will all this require? Well, there's a very famous historian in Britain called David Kynaston, and he's written a history of Britain since the Second World War. And you may know that after the Second World War, we had a government, it almost doesn't matter what political party it was a Labour government, which embarked upon a series of reforms, such as nationalisation of steel and coal, enhancing the welfare state, things of that kind, as a result of which, by the way, inequality did decline. And it was thought to be quite a successful government. And David Kynaston gave 4 reasons why he thought it had been successful. These were the preconditions, if you like, for the policies. The policies were very hard. They were the economic policies were very tough, as they were in all countries recovering from the war. First of all, shared purpose, everybody accepting the need for a policy. Our Chancellor at one point, George Osborne, saying, we're all in it, we're all in this together. Secondly, equity of sacrifice, the better off accepting that they should contribute more to the effort involved. Thirdly, hope, a sense that the new policy would deliver better outcomes, in this case, lower inequality. And finally, and this is not a joke, confidence in the political class. Well, those are my suggestions about what is actually needed. Whether they will happen or not, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic, but I have no other conclusion from the facts that are here than this one here. Thank you very much for listening to me.